Welcome to How We Get Through, the podcast where we share stories, mental health insights, and healing advice on life's everyday challenges. I'm your host, Jen, and today's guest is Kelsey Grimm, a registered clinical counselor from British Columbia, Canada. In this episode, Kelsey shares how family shame patterns are formed and how it can translate to feeling unlovable. This feels like such a heavy topic, and it can be, but I still want to invite you into this conversation because it also can be very empowering. And if you listen to the podcast so far, you know that we can go deep, but we always come out the other side. So take a listen. Hi, and welcome to the How We Get Through podcast. Today's guest is Kelsey Grimm. She's a registered clinical counselor in British Columbia, Canada, and she helps people get through trauma, anxiety, and depression. She's the founder and clinical director of a group practice called Healing Spaces. She's a self-proclaimed counseling geek and loves self-discovery and exploration. She's a lifelong learner, a healer, and has a wonderful husband, a toddler, a baby on the way, and 2 dogs and a cat. Hi, Kelsey. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I love the way you Americans always say Canada. It's always so cute. It gets me to giggle.
How do I say it?
Canada. Like the A, like Canada. We say Canada.
But how are we?
The R goes down, but your A's go up.
Canada.
Right? I know. It sounds more interesting than when you say it, though.
Canada, yeah. I love it. I love it. Awesome. Well, we'd love to open every show with a mental health myth, and we would love to know yours.
Yeah. So there's a famous Freud quote that says, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. And it always gets me to giggle. Freud, take it or leave it, for better, for worse. But when we look at things through a trauma-informed and an intergenerational lens, which I love to do, and which the workshop that I created is all about, this quote doesn't really hold up anymore. It's not that your mother or your parents didn't impact you. Of course they did, in some maybe wonderful and not wonderful ways. But the truth is that unless we kind of zoom out and look at the trauma that they might have experienced or the family stories that they're holding, then we really understand the impact that they had on us. I don't want to negate the impact that your parents had on you or throw your parents under the bus. But I think when we can hold both stories, when we can hold, yes, I was negatively impacted by my parents and my parents have their own wounds, it kind of shows us that we can move closer towards our own healing.
Yes, I love that. And I think for me as a new therapist, I always focused on the parents, and I'm like, well, it's your parents' fault. Where's your parents' fault? And then I became the parent, and I was like, oh man, like how much more is there to unpack in this? And it's not just one person's fault. There are direct implications, right? But there's like a history, a generational part that is so influential in the way that we parent or break cycles or not break cycles.
Totally. And it just kind of happens, honestly, without us even thinking. Like, it would just respond or react or interact with our kiddos in a certain way. And it is really fascinating when we look at it from like, that zoom out lens, as opposed to like, well, your parents should have done this, your parents should have done that. Like, that's very blamey. And I like to look at it and kind of turn it on its head a little bit and unpack it a little bit differently. So that is the myth. It's not all your mother. I mean, it probably is partly your mother, but it's not really all your mother.
Yes, I love that. And speaking of trauma, what made you get into the mental health field? Because, we're all a little messed up, but would love to know your story about how you decided into this.
Yeah, so I think I was built for this. I don't know what else I would do, honestly, in my life other than counseling. I was actually 14 years old and I was getting some mental health care myself. And the counselor I was seeing was doing a garbage job. And I knew that at 14. And I was like, well, I can do a better job than that. And I kind of feel like at that point, like Healing Spaces was born. Like, I knew I wanted to go into clinical counseling. I knew I wanted to run a group practice. I knew I wanted to do a better job than this garbage counselor I was seeing. And I really wanted to like hear people and support them in their healing, because I knew what it was like to struggle and I knew what it was like to work through healing. And so from there, I kind of like created the foundation of what Healing Spaces has kind of become, which is kind of interesting. So for sure, it was for my own personal healing. It's morphed and changed over the years, but that's kind of the birthplace of it all.
Yeah. And would you give us like some insight into schooling in Canada. Like, is it from undergrad to master's level? Did you go right away? Did you know from 14 years old this was your career path, or did it look a little bouncy
I mean,
along
it
the
looks
way?
bouncy, right? Like, like in our 20s, are we ever linear? Like, holy smokes, there's so much life to live in our 20s. I did my undergrad. I was still struggling a bit with my mental health in my undergrad. So my undergrad actually took like quite a long time for me to complete. And then I did a master's in leadership, and then I did a master's in counseling. So you do have to have a master's degree in Canada to do counseling work if you're a registered clinical counselor, or if you're a Canadian certified counselor or psychotherapist. It does change a bit province to province with the designations. Hopefully that's going to shift in the next couple of years. It's kind of confusing to the public, which is legit. But yeah, we do have to have a master's degree. And then the leadership master's has been fantastic in conjunction to be able to support my team and the clinicians that we have that also do the amazing work with our clients.
That's awesome. Do you have to do a 3,000 hour, like, do you have to do hours after you graduate, or do you do hours within?
We do the hours, yeah. So you do the hours in your practicum placement, and then that's usually not enough to get your designation afterwards. So often after a counselor graduates from their program and they've done the practicum within the program, they often have to do seek other supervision to do the counseling hours to reach that designation. So the designation in British Columbia is run by the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counselors, which I'm a part of. And so they have certain criteria for becoming a registered clinical counselor. And then they have certain requirements for becoming an accredited, I think it's an accredited certified supervisor. So I hold that title as well. And that's really fun because I get to actually support new clinicians, practicum students, in developing their clinical practice. So that's become a huge passion of mine, as well as practicum. I don't know if any of y'all have gone through it, but oh my gosh, like, it's so challenging, and often you're working at the same time and juggling so much, and there's school assignments. So it's been wonderful to be able to offer that to some new clinicians, as well as supporting them in their passions of becoming a counselor too. So
I love that, because I feel like most practicum sites is where the trauma begins for most students, where they're just like super unhealthy, like nonprofits. And like, I know my supervisor definitely had borderline personality disorder. Like, it was just so unhealthy and so traumatic. And it's like your first experience in therapy. So it is like so good when you have that experience. It sounds similar. Like, you had a shit counselor. You had, I don't know if you had a shit practicum, but it's like,
I had a wild ride. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like, oh, I can do this better and start healing. Again, it feels like that breaking of the cycle, like, and that's how we kind of landed together, because we met on Instagram and like became fast friends, which was so great. And we were talking about like what course, you talked a lot about trauma, what course can we kind of like niche down, and we landed on breaking family shame patterns, something super light, super easy. But I would just like to know like what excited you about that course, and where does that impact you in your own life? Where do you see that in your clients? Like, tell me everything.
I just feel like it weaves in and touches so many places. So I'll cite Freud again. For some reason, he's on top of mind right now. So he's considered one of the founders of psychology. And yet, I like, for better or for worse, because there's been a lot of harm that's caused as well, that from things that he said and theories he's held, they've been outdated. But, he also holds a theory that it was the client's fault, that you, like, quote unquote, you're like, are the way you are, or you're not good enough, or you're broken, or whatever the story is that person's holding. It's your fault, and society's perfect, and your family's perfect, and your job is perfect, and yet it's you. Why can't you do differently or do better? And that's just like not the case. Again, we really need to zoom out. We need to look at society. We need to look at community. We need to look at the traumas that you've lived through, the cumulative effect of those over time, the impacts of growing up in the family with the stories that you have. And so I think when we zoom out and see that lens, we have so much more compassion for when we're struggling with mental health, because it's not that if I were a different person, I could have done better. The circumstances were laid out that I tripped up in certain ways. And doesn't that make sense given the situation I was raised in and the circumstances that were going on in my community and all of these pieces? And so it was through, actually, Jen, like, I know you and I, so much fun chatting with you every time, but like, we were like workshopping and back and forth around the topic and what we can do and how to weave all these things into like 3 10-minute videos, which was really, really hard.
Yes.
And we kind of landed on the shame piece, because I think shame too is one of those things that we hold that even more is like, oh, it's my fault. I'm bad. I'm not good enough. And that is so heavy and so weighty. And I think creates so many more wounds for ourselves. And the lens that we have on the world then is it's all my fault. And that's simply not the case. And so I wanted to kind of challenge that story a little bit and offer some opportunities for self-compassion and for sure some for opportunities for insight and healing, because that's totally my jam, around like, how can we talk about shame with this perspective and view that it's really not all about you, but what does that even mean? And like, how do we even start that conversation? It's not about saying, to that voice or that thought that says like, I'm bad. Oh, no, you're not. You're really good. Like, that's not going to hold water. That's not.
Yes. Yes.
We need to kind of go a little bit deeper and kind of dive into these tougher topics to better understand why the stories that we're holding are there and how we've come to believe them is true and what we can do to like bust them open.
Yes. Oof. I love that. I love that. Yes. Yeah. And it's so interesting too, because I think you bring up two different kind of pieces of like this internal personal shame, this story, and then our generational familial shame, right? This family shame, this generational shame, this passed on shame, and how we can kind of like separate them out, or that they're two different things, but they're also really intertwined.
Totally. Like the fact that I have brown eyes or because I have brown eyes. But if you look at my family, it makes sense that I have brown eyes, right? So they're my brown eyes, and yet it makes sense kind of where they've come from. And so and society and all those pieces too. But like, yeah, it is really interesting when we tease it out, because it's not that that my shame isn't a part of like my healing. It is, but we want to see how it's connected to other pieces as well to better understand it. Because I feel like when we understand things more thoroughly, then we can start to really do that work and heal and kind of unpack our own baggage of shame that we're carrying.
Yeah. And it almost in some ways helps you heal collectively. In like, even if your mom isn't a part of that, we're bashing on moms today, but what a mom. And even if your mom, right, exactly. Even if they're not exactly part of that healing, or you're having conversations about that, you can kind of see where they maybe would need to heal, or what would have been healing for you in your life. Or, I think you could just have more space around it, which then can create more empathy for them and yourself, which can help like loosen up the shame.
Ooh, I like
right? It's like
totally. Yeah. I like that.
What do you like about that?
Like it because it's true.
That?
Like it's almost like it's too tight. It's suffocating. And you can't breathe. And so when we start to understand it and have a bit more compassion or understanding of maybe what's contributing to the way that we were raised, when it's looser, we can breathe a little bit more. We can see more clearly. We're not being strangled by it, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Like as parents, because I think there's so many pressures, and raising your kids and doing all the things in the way that they need to be done. And so I think also we can have a little bit of compassion for ourselves kind of on that side of like, hey, I'm sandwiched here between, all this lineage and stories that have come like that I'm a part of, and now I'm going to be passing those on. So I definitely want to do, and I hear this from so many parents, I want healing so it's better for my kids, which is like such a beautiful story. And how do we do that in a way where we still have self-compassion for when I slip up or I say something I don't want or in a tone that I don't want? And so I think that, yeah, like you can't just separate one person outside of like you say, the collective, right?
Yes. I think that's such a good point. I was just talking about this the other day of like getting stuck in my own like parenting shame spiral or cycle, and trying to connect it to my own child, to the past, to the things that I couldn't do that my daughter's doing that I'm having a hard time with. Like it was just so, and I think this past week for me, it's been hard to get out of that. Like it's been hard to regulate myself enough to like, okay, let's go back in. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm regulated. And then I'm like, boom, like skyrocket back up. Like it just, and it's just interesting, I think the biggest part in healing anything is that self-awareness, is that like digging deep. It's such hard work. And, I'm a therapist, you know what I mean? Like I know, I get it. And I ask clients to do that all the time, but when you're in it, it just can feel like so cyclical. Like it's just like this round thing. And again, like awareness or space, like loosening the cycle feels like a good entryway into starting that.
Totally. And when you're in it, oh my word, it's such heavy lifting. Even if you've been there before, even if you've done, yeah, I know, right?
Yes.
Even if you've done so much work, I almost think of it like if we have like this one story, like this shame that we're carrying, and we're like, okay, sweet, like I did all this healing on like this section, like I've got this, like gone. And then you're like, whoa, wait, there's another section here? Like, hang on a second, I thought I crushed this. And like, why are you still popping up? And then we do healing on that section. And then there's another one, right? There's these different ways it can kind of pop up and we feel like we're right back in it, like right at the beginning.
Right back.
And shame is deep, girl. Like shame is deep. Like it pulls us down and it's so painful, right? It really is. And I think too, when it's going on, it's really hard sometimes not to get lost in it or to kind of like climb out of it, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because I'm wondering if, I think for me in that experience, it felt like the shame was keeping me in that cycle.
Yeah, totally.
Oof, right?
Yeah.
Like you know you shouldn't be doing this, or you're an angry person, or you need to handle your rage. Oh, it makes me teary, right? Like that. And this is the shame, right? Even just talking about it. And like, you know, we talk about a lot about emotions and like body and like releasing the energy. And I think that's what's happening for me right now is just, and when you take a deep breath, like this isn't my session, but it feels very safe in even just recognizing where I'm needing to release the shame narrative that I'm a bad mom.
And I think that's like another hard part. I mean, all this stuff is hard, but it's so beautiful too, right? Like this opportunity, like, you know, Jen, whatever those tears are, like I even feel teary, like whatever those tears are holding or whatever that's representing in your life right now, like there's like it is you have self-awareness, it is coming to your consciousness, so it's like, okay, this is another like chapter that I can like move through, explore, and like I have another opportunity to do a little bit more healing, which we know is heavy lifting, and yet we know when we get to the other side it's always worth it, right?
Yeah, it is like that hand thing, right? The finger, it feels like this deeper layer, right? Like you got that, okay, here's where it's deeper, more connected on this different level, right? And it's like, I think always going internal, but then expanding out, like, how did I get here, right? And where else isn't this just mine? Like, where's my responsibility? But I think in being a bad mom, we take like over responsibility, or I tend to personalize it more than like my child is just having a hard time. So I'm having a hard time.
Totally.
Love it. So this, I mean, I feel like I'm not that I'm like so deep in my journey in self-exploration, but I think my example was like, I mean, it's in real time and it's happening, and I've done a lot of work in kind of unraveling that. I mean, the work will be endless. But if someone is just starting off of like, how do I know if I have a shame family pattern? Like, could this be like in parenting or not even with parenting or with a partner? Like what are some like indications that there might be some shame there?
I think that really comes down to like a really good cue can be like our negative self-talk and our like internalization of, so if something's going on outside and we're like, oh, it's my fault, or it's because I'm not good enough, or it's because I'm bad. So I talk about this in the workshop too, but the difference between shame and guilt. So guilt is I've done something bad, but shame is, oof, I am bad. And that one's deep, right? So any kind of other versions of that, like I'm not good enough, it's all my fault, like that internalization of an external situation, it's all on me, like I need to make this all better. All of those kind of thoughts that we might have or stories that we might have, it's all my fault. Those are kind of indications that you might be experiencing some shame. And who knows, maybe it is connected to some kind of family pattern of shame or I often will ask folks like, how did you learn that you're bad? Like, how did the world teach you that you're bad? And so I think that question can be really revealing in terms of like, hey, when did I start thinking this? And how did I come to believe this is true? Was it, Sue on the playground that did something and that kind of stuck with me? Or was it a comment that was made by a family member? Or, was it a teacher that did something that really like impacted me? Like, where did that come from? And so these kind of compounding over time, and they may seem so, especially when we're little, because we're so tender and vulnerable, right? These little parts, and you internalize it and think it's all your fault, or you think that you're bad. And then over time, as an adult, so there's an example I give in the workshop that's intentionally like light and playful, but something really mild happens, and you kind of cascade down into this like pit of shame. And so when we can step back and be like, whoa, how did I go from this fairly like mild experience into I'm a bad person, I'm not good enough, it's all my fault? That might be an indication that if those stories happen, if that kind of leap happens, that you're experiencing some shame, and there's opportunity for exploration and healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking, like, while you were talking, because I have some clients currently that have expressed like actual kind of shaming language from their parents. Like, and there could be like, it could just be also just like blatant, we talk about this a lot, like your parents' limited ability to show love or to show that you're good, right? So it's like, as kids, we look at the world and we start internalizing and picking up things, right? And so I think that's what you're saying is like this process of what were you picking up?
And
it's not
kid. To villainize parents, because it's not that they probably think you're amazing, but do they know how to communicate that? Do they know how to validate you in the way that you need at the right time, right? Or even really common language like, oh, bad boy or bad girl. Like we don't use that language in our household because I'm so sensitive to it, but because I don't even want those thoughts floating around my kiddos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think there is like a millennial generational thing where there's a lot of parents trying to do like gentle parenting or like just doing it differently. And so you have to go back and look at your wounds, right? You have to go back and be like, oh, this is what it was like growing up. I don't want that for my kid, but what is the next way forward?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wonder if I feel like implicit in exploring gentle parenting, parents must have some kind of self-awareness too. I don't want this for my kid. Like, these were the wounds that I have, which is so beautiful. I call that being a change agent in your kind of family story, which I think is really powerful and so hard, but so cool. If you're changing like one piece of the family story, you're changing it for all the future generations. I mean, that's like immense, like just like thinking about that, right? Like the ability you have to shift and change a story for the better in your family is immense. And so, yeah, the gentle parenting movement, I definitely love that. I think it's so beautiful because I think it's a really positive shift.
Yeah. A hard shift, but very positive.
And then we have a dialogue, and then we like vent with our partner and be like, oh, this is what I really wanted to say, but I didn't, and I did this instead, and I stayed regulated. Yes. It's like, happy dance, I did it,
Yes. Yes. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I was like to my husband, I was like, I am so proud of like how like not angry I'm getting. And then this week I'm just like, rage, and that's the ebb and flow because we get triggered. It's just, again, the cycle. So it's life, right? So how do we kind of move through our own shame spiral in order to reconnect back to ourselves and reconnect back to our children and our husband? And like the art of repair is what I have to deeply believe in. And I could see that when I do repair and like my daughter looks me in the eyes, and which is just powerful, even like looking at someone's eyes, and then hugs me. And I'm like, wow, okay. Like, oof, that feels okay.
Right? Like, ooh, yeah. But then forgive ourselves too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is the harder work. Yeah. Forgiving ourselves. So good. So good. Can you speak a little bit more for the people that maybe don't have children in where relationally shame can kind of like, what are some examples that where shame can creep up where it feels like, oh, we saw our parents do this, or this generational thing, or even just trauma in that?
Yeah. And it's all connected, right? So like if you were raised in a household with two parents, even seeing the dynamic between the two of them is going to teach you a lot about what it's like to be in relationship with other people. And so sometimes in a relationship dynamic, there can be one parent that maybe is a bit overpowering or kind of dominating, and one parent that is more passive. Or if both parents are kind of equal in those pieces in their kind of power dynamic, then sometimes there can be a little bit of like over with the kiddos too, right? Because there is a little bit of power dynamic there too. And so even subtle comments that can be made can impact us, and we internalize them. And then we go out into the world with these stories. And because it's all relational, it comes out in our friendships or our romantic partnerships or with our bosses or with our colleagues. And so sometimes when we see these stories coming out for us around, I'm bad, I'm not good enough, or we have those thoughts in our minds in a certain relationship, like oftentimes folks will have it at work. I need to do better, I'm not good enough, or whatever the stories are. I need to hustle, I need to impress, I need to prove. Where's that coming from? That's coming from that kind of lack place of like, I'm not inherently good enough as I am. And so everything I do and everything I touch isn't good enough. Or even in the way we have relationships with our body, my body isn't good enough. It needs to look like this. I need to be this type of person. And we kind of, put on a pedestal these ideals of who we think we should be and try to live up to that, knowing that that's like an impossible thing. And then we fall, and then we go, oh, it's because I'm not good enough. It's because I'm bad. It's because I can't. And so it can come out in so many places, these aspects of shame in our lives. And they're heavy. Like, these stories are heavy. And often they're in relationships. So like relationship with others and relationship to ourselves as well.
Yeah, it almost feels like the cost is relational, right? If my body doesn't look good enough, if I'm not smart enough, the cost relational for me is that my partner won't love me, my kids won't love me, my boss won't think I'm excellent, right? There's a rejection. I don't know what it is. I feel like relational cost I kind of keep coming back to. And it's like the thing that we want. We want to belong. We want to feel like we fit in. We want to be with people. And this internal dialogue tells us often that we aren't, right? And so do these external things to be with.
Totally. And you use such a powerful word, Jen. I don't even know if you noticed, use lovable. And that often, like when we deduce further, it's like, I'm not lovable. Like, I know I'm not worthy of love. Like, oh, my word, right? But even saying those words, like, if that feels like that resonates with you, people out there listening, like, oh my goodness, like, you are lovable. I'm going to get teary. Like, you are worthy of love. You are perfectly imperfect just the way you are. Like, just who you are is enough, And yet we have these stories that we need to do XYZ, or I need to be XYZ, Z, Canada Z, to be able to be worthy. And so, yeah, if I have the story that I'm not lovable, absolutely there's going to be a relational cost to that. Either we're going to be hustling for a relationship, or we're going to be shying away from it because we're too fearful that truth could be proven, right?
Yes.
Oh,
and that I know. And that story comes from the family part, right? And what we infer about ourselves and the cues that we pick up. So it's interesting. Like, I mean, maybe we just cracked the code of like psychology. It's all everything external. All the problems actually come down to feeling good enough or lovable. So there's your gold nugget.
There's the gold nugget. Hey, and yeah, totally. It can get deduced down to that if we were to, summarize. Hey.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Kelsey, thank you so much for coming on and talking more about shame. It was so good to connect with you and like be in this flow together. Thank you for letting me, get teary too and share my stuff and my story. We loved having you on. So, thank you so much for being a part of How We Get Through. Listeners, if you want to stay tuned for part 2, where Kelsey's going to give some quick tips on how to notice and work through more family shame patterns, you won't want to miss it. Thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to our show. We hope we gave you some insight into the origins of shame and how family patterns can be passed on. If you finished this episode with a desire to dive deeper into your own healing, check out Kelsey's course, Family Shame Patterns, on the How We Get Through app, available for both Android and iPhone. Stay tuned for next week's episode as Kelsey describes ways we can be mindful and move through our past intergenerational shame. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.